to today's 19V seminar. We have a fascinating talk ahead of us today. Our speaker will be Nikita Balagurov of Lund University, who with me is the co-organizer of the 19V Art History Seminar. Nikita will be speaking on picturing Russian Soviet Empire, Ilia Repin's Reception of the Volost Elders by Alexander II, and its afterlife in Stalin's Kremlin. Our scheduled собеседник today, Christine Ruan of University of Tulsa, is unable to be with us today. So today's собеседник will be our very own Anne Lounsbury from New York University. So Nikita.
Okay, well, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the Big 19V team for organizing such a wonderful series of seminars in the first place, and of course, for having me here. I'm so thrilled to present my paper to such a fantastic audience. In fact, it was at one of our first little 19V art history seminars that I presented first bits of this research and received wonderful feedback. Now, as I'm currently co-organizing the 19V Art History Seminar with Margaret, I would like to invite everyone interested in visual arts and culture of the Russian Empire in the long 19th century to attend our meetings. Then the first part of today's talk is based on my contribution to Russian Orientalism in a global context, hybridity, encounter, and representation, which will be out next year with Manchester University Press in Rethinking Arts History series. And I would like to thank Marietta Rutina and Alison Lee, the editors of this timely and much needed volume, and also very kind and patient editors, I must add. I'm also grateful to Alexandria Institute at University of Helsinki and my advisor there, Elina Kahla, for creating the most comfortable environment for the work on this chapter. Finally, I would like to thank Evgeny Manjurin for the patient editor and proofreader of so many of my English texts. Okay. So Reception of Volost Elders portrays one of the key events in the celebrations of Alexander III's ascension to the throne on a May Day in 1883, his address at the ceremonial dinner to the representatives of the peasantry. For the first time, more than 600 elected Volost Elders, chiefs of townships, traveled from all over the Russian Empire to participate in the coronation of a new monarch. Historian Richard Wortman interpreted the ceremony as the marker of, quote, the peasants' inclusion as an honorable estate in the framework of Russian monarchy, unquote. Accordingly, Repin's painting, in his words, quote, makes clear the change in the relationship between the emperor and the people occurring in the new reign. The emperor and the peasants are at the same level, facing each other as fellow human beings, in contrast to representations of Alexander II standing above the peasants who look up worshipfully. End of quote. While this is a very plausible interpretation, there is yet another peculiar aspect that makes Reception of Volost Elders worth studying in an imperial context: the ethnic diversity of the people surrounding the Tsar. As this paper will show, Repin's painting was a nuanced reflection of what Frederick Cooper and Ann Stoller called the tensions of empire. Just as Russia's dominant approach to dealing with those tensions was, according to Valery Kivelson and Ron Suney, to rule through difference, that is, quote, cobbling together different regions and peoples, each subject to their own relations with the center, unquote, Repin too followed a differentiating approach to rendering non-Russian minorities in the painting. The case of Repin's Reception of Volost Elders provides an opportunity to look at the ways in which different imperial narratives took shape under the brush of a renowned realist painter. But it also shows how the artist's brushwork acted as a means of artistic empowerment, reversing the center-periphery model of imperial representation. The coronation of 1883 presented Alexander III as an emphatically Russian Tsar. His appearance at solemn ceremonies, such as the one in Repin's painting, featured elements of what can be described as national dress: jack boots, sheepskin hat, and a red sash. Wortmann suggests that this image was in line with the new approach to representing the Russian Empire as a colonial power and the emperor as a ruler of the empire's native people, the Russians. A coronation volume expressed sentiments of national superiority and colonial disdain, describing the Asian representatives as, quote, a messy crowd bumping into each other, a murderously funny procession of savages, unquote. Elsewhere in the coronation album, the tendency and the sentiment that Repin was expected to visualize is outlined in more detail. It says, there one could see representatives of positively every tribe and people that make up the empire. One could only clearly see that the mass of the Russian people is so great that the peoples comprise merely a minuscule particle stuck to the Russian body, and that from the moral point of view, all those peoples have long been engulfed by the all-encompassing spiritual world of the Russian people. There is one people in Russia, the Russian people, one sovereign, the Russian Tsar. The rest cling to the Russian edifice and by the base of the Russian throne, as the swallows that attach their nests under the roofs of formidable houses. Repin clearly did not adhere to such rhetoric. Both the idealization of the Russian people as well as the xenophobic attitude towards other peoples were alien to his previous works. Repin had been drawn to multi-figure compositions featuring various ethnic types and colorful costumes, seeing them as opportunities for contrasting juxtapositions. Given that, it is not surprising that he was attracted by the opportunity to depict the colorful variety of costumes and types, including ethnic ones, made available through the courtly commission. In his letter to the collector Pavel Tretyakov, Repin wrote, quote, "This new theme is quite rich and I like it, especially from the technical side, the Tsar and the people with the court nobility in the background. What a variety of types, expressions, faces, contrasts of the most unexpected and artistic kind," unquote. In the 1884 sketch from Łódź demonstrates enthusiasm for the picturesque elements of the scene. Here he takes advantage of the colorful clothes and headdresses of the non-Slavic representatives attending the dinner. Most of these elements were based on photographs from an album featuring group pictures of the guests. Noteworthy is the tall Volga Tatar Seyful Batalov in a bright pink shirt, blue coat, and gold-embroidered green tubiteyka. He stands to the right of the emperor and a group of Slavic elders in black, adding a splash of color to this part of the composition. Two less prominent figures function in a similarly decorative manner: an anonymous Tatar in a purple coat and red tubiteyka, partly visible several heads below Seyed Batalov, and the red-bearded Gurian Mikhail Ninitsa in a red jacket and turban at the left edge of the sketch. Repin does not enforce ethnic hierarchy in the sketch to the extent we see in the final version of the painting. The rendering of the event clearly did not suit the client. Repin kept changing the composition and eventually moved the emperor to the front towards the viewer, thus making the latter an active participant in the scene rather than a passive observer of the lively crowd. This simultaneously required Repin to add more detail to the faces and figures of the elders standing next to Alexander. By closely following the client's apparent request to zoom in on the central figure as much as possible, the artist found himself in a very vulnerable position. He had to produce an illusion of presence in the scene that he had not actually witnessed. This must have made Repin all the more susceptible to the guidance and advice of direct participants in the event, as well as making him more dependent on already existing visual and verbal accounts of it. These circumstances conditioned Repin's shift from a picturesque rendering of imperial diversity to the more elaborate and hierarchical interpretation. Historian Andreas Kappeler has suggested a scheme that illustrates the cultural hierarchy of ethnic groups in the 19th century Russian Empire. He presented it as a system of concentric circles extending from the imperial center. A group's distance from the center was determined by the degree of its otherness in the empire. The innermost circles comprised Orthodox people, quote, their confession bound them more closely than the other ethnic groups to ruler, dynasty, and empire, and Orthodoxy was officially proclaimed one of Russia's 3 basic principles, unquote. The closest to the Tsar was the Russian people, consisting of the Great Russian, Little Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian tribes. On the outer fringe of the Orthodox imperial core were Orthodox non-Slavs, such as Georgians. Moving outward, the next circle included non-Orthodox Christians. The next category, that of sedentary non-Christians, was further detached from the imperial center and comprised several Muslim ethnic groups. Finally, inarodцы, aliens, the Jews, nomads of Central Asia, and sedentary Muslims of Turkestan occupy the outermost circle of the empire's cultural hierarchy. Their racial otherness and cultural distance were deemed so alien as to preclude their integration into the imperial system. Having this scheme in mind helps to navigate Repin's densely populated painting and see the logic in his compositional choices. Repin was exposed to various channels and artifacts through which this unofficial cultural hierarchy manifested itself. One of them was particularly important for the artist's work on the composition of the painting. The group photographs of the elders participating in the 1883 coronation celebrations featured 60 photographs taken in Mikhail Nestyukov's atelier several days before the dinner. With few yet meaningful exceptions, each group comprised representatives of a single administrative unit of the empire and followed in the unit's alphabetical order. Noteworthy is the album's cover, decorated with traditional Russian materials, including birch bark, straw plating, and carved wooden frame. A printed image on the cover features several village elders offering bread and salt in front of Moscow Kremlin. The Tsar was clearly the main addressee of the welcoming gesture and the album itself, which highlighted the centrality of the Russians in the hierarchy of peoples and their proximity to the ruler. Repin included a couple of Russian representatives from the album already in his Łódź sketch. Yakov Vorobyov and Stepan Paromov, the 2 bearded elders to the right of the emperor, were replicated exactly as they stood in the group photograph of the representatives from the Arkhangelsk governorate. Even more elders from the album found their way into the final version of the painting. A close examination of the canvas reveals the general pattern behind the figure's placement in the composition. Repin places Orthodox Slavs in a more prominent position and closer to the emperor, while representatives of other ethnicities and creeds are distanced and marginalized. Most indicative in this respect is the group of elders standing on the right-hand side of the Tsar. In the first row, and closest to the emperor, is a man in a dark blue kaftan with a gray bushy beard. This is Zakhar Sergevnin from the Vladimir governorate, a typical Great Russian, as one of the reviewers would refer to him. To his left are Taras Timofeyev from Voronezh governorate and Alexander Lychkov from the Chernigiv governorate, representing the so-called Great Russian and Little Russian tribes of the empire, respectively. A larger, bald elder standing next to them does not seem to have been modeled after an album prototype, but his lushy gray beard also hints at his Slavic Orthodox identity. Finally, the brightly dressed Mikhail Ninitsa or Ninidze and a tall elder with a light brown beard complete the row. Compositionally, this group was given an extremely advantageous position. Among the elders facing the viewer, this group stands closest to the emperor, comprising the innermost circle of the crowd. Standing behind the right shoulder of Alexander III, they look like a solid foundation to his authority. Repin's decision to move Mikhail Ninidze from the edge of the composition in the sketch to a central position in the final version is in line with Kepler's scheme, in which the Orthodox population of the Caucasus belongs to one of the inner circles in the hierarchy. The Gurians, whom Ninidze represented at the celebrations, are an Orthodox people of the Caucasus. They were viewed since the 1860s as the backbone of the regime in this highly volatile imperial periphery. In Repin's painting, Ninidze is not only standing in the row of elders closest to the emperor, but is equally engaged in the event. His mouth is half open, as if making a sound of appreciation for the Tsar's speech, while his face shows adoration, a detail that did not escape the attention of one newspaper reviewer. Non-Orthodox representatives and aliens occupy subordinate positions in the painting. Thus, Crimean Tatar Mengliadi Barmambetov is partially concealed by an anonymous bald elder in the front row. We can see only half of his face. Similarly rendered are two men in fur hats standing behind and to the left of Barmambetov. Repin only gave them grimaces of amazement and absurdly bulging eyes, as if intending to further alienate and depersonify these representatives of the outermost circle in the imperial hierarchy. Compositional placement of two more elders in the painting points at Repin's awareness of the position that Inarodse occupied in the public discourse in relation to the Russian Orthodox core. Here, Stepan Paromov, an already familiar Russian elder featured both in a Nestikov photograph and in the Łódź sketch, still occupies a place of honor in the inner circle. At the same time, Repin places Buryat Yegor Danchinov, absent in the sketch, behind Paromov's tall figure, so that the viewer can only see Danchinov peeking out from behind his shoulder. All in all, through compositional means, Repin's painting visualized the verbal image of the Russian Empire presented by the Coronation album's description of the elders' reception, quoted above. In the painting, the peoples of the empire are represented as either morally absorbed into the, quote, spiritual world of the Russian people, unquote, as is Ninidze in his admiration of the Russian Tsar, or like swallows' nests, they, quote, cling to the Russian edifice and by the base of the Russian throne, unquote. The Tatar man in the purple coat occupies a vividly marginalized position in the painting. For the final version, Repin decided to exclude the figure of Seyd Batalov and at the same time put the anonymous Tatar, but partially visible in his Łódź sketch, to the fore of the composition. The Tatar stands closest to the viewer in front of the black row of the backs of Volost Elders in a way that separates him not only from the emperor, but also from the crowd itself. Such a visualization reflects the particular place that Volga Tatars occupied on the mental map of the Russian Empire. The Tatar Khanate of Kazan was the first distinctly non-Russian territory conquered by the Russian state as early as the 16th century. Historian Robert Jersey summarized, quote, "By the 19th century, Kazan was no longer the eastern boundary of the empire. It had been buried deep within Russia under successive layers of conquered territory. But Kazan was still considered frontier and nearly alien territory due to the persistent diversity of its people and cultures," unquote. Tatars, however, remained the dominant ethnic group of the region and were viewed by many Russians with fear, if not contempt. Religion was the key factor alienating the Tatars from the Orthodox population of the empire. As a popular 1878 atlas put it, Mohammedanism still isolates them from the dominant tribe. They are almost completely absent from the social life of the Russians. They are not concerned with or interested in matters dear to every Russian. This context also explains the particularity of the Volga Tatars group photograph in Nestikov's album. It is the only example where the models are put together on the principle of ethnic and confessional rather than administrative grouping. 9 of them are also present in different photos in the album, where they are assembled together with other representatives of a distinct governorate. The articulated separateness of this photograph in the album reflects the Tatars' ambivalent status within the imperial hierarchy, visible yet marginal. Repin not only used this photograph to draft the figure of Seyid Batalov in the Watch sketch, but also saw it as a legitimate example for his own marginalizing treatment of the Tatar in the final version of the painting. The compositional placement of the Tatar also makes him a silent opponent of the Tsar. Detached from the crowd and competing with the emperor in scale, he takes a confrontational position. Positioning the Tatar in such a way, Repin also took advantage of the painterly opportunities that the inclusion of the purple robe into the foreground of the composition provided. Not only did Repin use it to bring a different color to the otherwise limited palette, but he also made it stand out against the predominantly dark coloration of surrounding fabrics. Widely applied, long, vibrant brushstrokes build the folds of the Tatar's coat as much as they attest to Repin's mastery, revealing his artistic presence in the painting. Apparently, this was one of the canvas's fragments which earned the artist reproaches for, quote, overemphasize nonchalant finish in the details, unquote. The critics' focus on the formal qualities of the painting reflects Repin's genuine interest in experimentation with brushstroke, even in this restrictive courtly commission. While he utilized photograph-like rendering for the faces and figures in the middle ground in the closest proximity to the Tsar, he allowed his purely artistic, painterly nature full freedom on the periphery of the scene and in the figure of the Tatar in particular. The style of execution that Repin showcases in the figure of the man in the purple coat was developed during his trip to Europe in 1883. For Repin, the ultimate goal of the journey was Madrid's Prado with its collection of Diego Velázquez, a painter whose works he had admired through photographs and dreamt to see with his own eyes. Repin's letters to Madrid and shortly after his return to Russia allow us to recognize a statement in the artist's bold treatment of the Tatar figure in the Reception of Volost Elders. Noteworthy is the very beginning of a lengthy passage in which Repin describes his impressions from the trip in a letter to Polenov. Quote, "It was Madrid that impressed me the most, by its art and life alike. After Madrid, I felt as that blissful, faithful Muslim who earned his right to wear a turban after his visit to Mecca," unquote. Metaphorical self-identification with a Muslim on a pilgrimage points at one of the greatest artistic conversions that happened to Repin in Madrid, primarily through his dedicated study and copying of Velázquez. In an earlier letter to Tretyakov, Repin described the discovery he had made in the process. Quote, "Velázquez, such a depth of knowledge, originality, brilliant talent, modest studies, and all this is overpowered by a deep passion for art, rich in ecstasy in each of his works of art. This is where his unfinishedness comes from. On the contrary, the tensions of profound creativity did not allow him to coldly finish the details." A few months later, in a letter to Polenov, Repin was more restrained in the assessment of Velázquez's oeuvre, contrasting his and Murillo's commissioned pieces with their folk types. But here too, Repin's point about the unfinishedness of what he calls, quote, "their best works" is telling. He interprets it as one of the consequences of a purely artistic, uncorrupted interest. Quote, "They were painted with fever, enthusiasm, in free time, for oneself. They remained unfinished, were abandoned as unnecessary. A completely different painting style, different attitude to work, commission." A few years later, Repin must have recalled his thoughts about the renowned Habsburg portraitist when he faced his own courtly commission. Just like Velázquez, he had to follow the demands of a courtly customer. As this paper has shown, Repin was very diligent in providing a compelling representation of the ceremonial scene and sensitive to the contemporary developments in the imperial agenda. His compositional mastery and art of illusion were instrumentalized to deliver the desired message. The limitations of the topic, program, and style stipulated by the Commission left him with only the composition's periphery as a relatively free area of artistic expression. Yet the brushwork on the peripheral, albeit quite large and very visible part of the composition, loudly speaks of his painterly presence. The purple coat takes on a function of a politically subversive modernist statement. Repin contrasted his nonchalant rendering of the Tatar man with the photographically based execution of the figure of the emperor and the loyal imperial corps, introducing the man in the purple coat, a freely painted, marginalized folk type, gave Repin the opportunity to shift his attention from the commissioned subject matter to the art of painting itself, thus challenging the relationships between content and form, realism and modernism, but also center and periphery. Through his subversive artistry, Repin transformed a marginalized imperial subject, peripheral in the ethno-social hierarchy of empire, into a powerful figure, essential in terms of artistic value and our perception of the painting. In 1887, Repin oversaw the installation of his painting in the antechamber of the Grand Kremlin Palace in Moscow. Alexander III chose the location where his painterly double will welcome the guests as they ascended the grand stairway leading to the main enfilade. The antechamber precedes four lavishly decorated halls which hosted the celebrations of the last three Russian coronations. Repin's painting took part in the last one, both in situ and popular with the guests, and virtually as a photograph reproduction in the coronation album of Nicholas II. The roots of this success lay both in the painterly qualities of the picture and in its smart placement. Art historian Igor Grabar described the impression it produced on the visitors. Quote, "As one went up the stairs, the crowd seemed to open up and become alive, the figures in the painting looking more real than the real people underneath it," unquote. Here, Grabar echoed the accounts of the visitors of the 1886 Moscow Peredvizhniki show, where the painting was exhibited prior to its transfer to the Kremlin. The tableau vivant quality of the painting most likely was the desired outcome in the eyes of the commissioner, the Ministry of the Imperial Court. That a lifelike grand scene was expected is confirmed by the fact that initially the commission was offered to the painter Konstantin Makovsky. In 1883, some months before the offer, Makovsky had his bombastic boyar wedding feast in the 17th century presented to Alexander III in Gatchina Palace. Even though the emperor did not purchase the painting, he attended the staging of the composition as a tableau vivant the same year and likely enjoyed the performance. In any case, Repin's painting became an active participant of imperial ceremonies at the Grand Kremlin Palace, not only welcoming, but also engaging the visitors in the performance of power, preparing them for the real encounter with the ruler. If this performativity per se made the painting just a fortunate fit for this ceremonial setting, its original picture frame earned it the status of a site-specific work of art, the one that loses substantial part of its meaning if removed from the intended location. As Oleg Tarasov has demonstrated, the frame design links the painting with the adjacent St. George Hall in several ways, most explicitly through the coats of arms of the lands and provinces of the Russian Empire. Indeed, the commemoration and glorification of empire building with the help of the Russian military is key to the decoration program of the hall. Long lists of army units, warship crews, and holders of the St. George Cross are inscribed in gold on the sides of white marble plaques covering its walls, whereas up above, under the triumphal vaulted ceiling, 18 allegorical statues of victory hold the shields displaying the coats of arms of the Russian czars and territories with dates of conquest. Thus, the painting frame design and the interior decorations of the hall fleshed out the imperial subtext of Repin's painting, providing a historical perspective and allegorical framing for the illusionistically rendered scene from the most recent past. This created a double exposure effect, which, together with the performativity of the painting, will be utilized by the future masters of the palace. But before delving into this, we should first dispute the established assumption that shortly after 1917, Repin's painting was removed from its place in the antechamber and wasn't available to the public eye before the collapse of the Soviet Union. In what follows, I demonstrate that the village elders not only reclaimed its prominent position after a short interlude, but also was instrumentalized to mediate the image of the new Soviet state and its leaders. In May 1922, the journalist Mikhail Koltsov spotted the painting in its original place while attending a session of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. His Pravda article titled "In Front of Repin's Painting" is full of dismissive irony towards the pathos of the picture, which allegedly seemed so ridiculous in the new Soviet reality. Another ironic reference to the painting appeared in Osip Mandelstam's Огонек article on the First International Peasants' Conference in 1923. Quote, "Huge canvas, a boisterous czar amid the chief janitors, Верховные дворники, in undercoats with badges, and the coronation burats." The poet apparently alluded to what he perceived as the burats' purely decorative function at the coronation ceremony, that of a sign of empire, in Richard Workman's words, in contrast to their newly elevated status within the Buryat-Mongol Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, created several months earlier in May 1923. All in all, in the early 20s, reception of the village elders seemed an awkward background to the sessions of the Soviet government and international organizations. In 1924, a more appropriate painting replaced Repin's canvas. Isaac Brodsky spent several years executing Lenin's speech at the Second World Congress of the Comintern. A huge canvas featuring hundreds of portraits of Congress delegates gained Brodsky the fame of Raphael of our time. That is how his former professor Ilia Repin would respond to the pupil's achievement. The painting's triumph, however, didn't last long, as many of the prototypes turned out to be enemies of the people and disappeared in the purges. It was in the 1930s that Repin's painting reclaimed its dignity in the eyes of the Soviet government. In 1933, the Central Executive Committee published this set of postcards featuring color photographs of ceremonial halls of the Grand Kremlin Palace. The first postcard in the set shows the staircase leading to the open doors of the antechamber, through which one could clearly recognize the silhouettes of the Tsar and the village elders. A black and white version of this photograph is put on the set's cover next to the title, repeated in several national languages of the Soviet Union. The publication of the series preceded a major reconstruction of the Kremlin Palace in 1933 and 34. In its course, the palace lost two of its original reception halls, St. Andrew and St. Alexander halls, replaced with a huge conference hall of the Supreme Soviet. Driven by the need to accommodate the work of the Soviet bodies of power, the reconstruction project kept the entrance group of the palace intact, with its grand staircase, the antechamber, and the St. George Hall. With Stalin's elevation to the realm of deities, this space claimed center stage in Stalin's performances of power in the Kremlin, and Repin's painting played a crucial role in staging at least several of these performances. In the 1930s, the village elders was no longer a convenient antithesis for the image of the young Soviet state. Instead, it became a point of reference or a role model suggesting a new, though old, scheme of power relations between the leader and his subjects. Joachim von Ribbentrop, his account of his encounter with the painting during his infamous visit to Moscow in September 1939, follows exactly this line of perception. Quote, Stalin gave us a banquet to which all members of the Politburo were invited. As my colleagues and I ascended the stairs of the former Tsarist palace in which the banquet took place, we were confronted, to our surprise, by a large painting showing Tsar Alexander II among his peasants after the abolition of serfdom, which is Ribbentrop's wrong attribution of the topic, of course. This, like much else, seemed to indicate an evolution in the course of which world revolutionary principles were given way to a more conservative tendency. The film Peter the Great, which had its first night in Moscow at the same time, seemed to point in the same direction, unquote. The new tendency mentioned by Ribbentrop illustrates the shift in Stalinist propaganda that has been examined and interpreted by scholars for a while now. The return of the pre-revolutionary past to mainstream ideology that took place in the mid-1930s. It has received extensive scholarly attention in the last 80 years, being conceptualized as the Great Retreat in Nicholas Timashev's 1948 book, or more recently as epic revisionism. That is how Kevin Platt and David Brandenberger described the mid-1930s shift in Soviet official cultural production towards a more nationalistic interpretation of pre-revolutionary history with emphasis on Russian heroes of the past. The authors attribute this process to Stalin's increased focus on state building and legitimation of his personal power. However, as these and many other scholars have shown, it was the more distant past that Stalin's propaganda emphasized. The latter would generally, if not exclusively, orient Soviet artists, authors, filmmakers, and composers towards the heroes and rulers from the medieval and early modern periods. The heroes and rulers were to be selected on the basis of their progressive role in the Stalinist version of Russian history. Thus, Alexander Nevsky, Ivan the Terrible, and Peter the Great became the most celebrated figures in the mid-1930s and 40s. At this time, Soviet cultural production portrayed Ivan Grozny and Peter the Great as modernizers who, just like Stalin, were able to suppress whatever reactionary forces obstructed the progress, while Alexander Nevsky was celebrated as a defender of Russia from foreign invaders. Rulers from the 19th century, especially the last Romanovs, were not popular with the propaganda as they clearly suppressed the socialist movement and the revolutionary struggle. In this context, it is surprising to find a direct association of Stalin with Repin's depiction of Alexander III, drawn by Mikhail Chiurelli in his 1946 film, The Vow. The film portrayed Stalin as Lenin's successor and became a path-breaking representation of the emerging cult of personality. The clip I'm going to show you, and I'll just start the clip, but I will speak over it to save time, and I will return to the content.
Какие яркие портреты, правда? Кто это нарисовал? Репин. Я тебе уже говорила, Репин.
So the director gradually immerses the characters, a Soviet family, and other guests at the reception into the atmosphere of Stalinist myth. They meet their esteemed contemporaries, the demigods of Stalinist pantheon, the pilot Ivan Podubny, the crash worker Alexei Stakhanov, and others. Their dreamlike stroll through different halls of the palace brings them to Repin's painting, which operates as an avatar of their personal encounter with the Soviet leader that duly follows in just a few frames. In his depiction of the encounter with Stalin in St. George Hall, Chiurelli recreates Repin's composition, while Stalin enters a circle of admiring workers and peasants, takes the place of the emperor, and pronounces a speech. This episode has been almost entirely missed in scholarship on The Vow, likely because it doesn't fit with the analytical interpretations. For Evgeny Dobrenko, for instance, The Vow indicated the shift in Stalinist legitimation from historical illusion to the portrayal of Stalin as obtaining his legitimacy directly from the hands of the Soviet people, without any historical, and this is a quote, without any historical illusions whatsoever, unquote. To be sure, Chiaureli's film is radically different from Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible Part 2, lambasted and banned by Stalin just as the Vow was hitting the Soviet screens. That said, the episode with Repin's painting seems to suggest the importance of historical imagery in the portrayal of Stalin as a legitimate leader in the Vow. Petr Petrov, who, unlike Dobrenko, recognizes historical allusions in the film, though he also neglects the Repin episode, writes that in the Vow, quote, "The entire history of Russia has been turned into a mythic infrastructure that preconfigures the course of events as well as the fates of people. Stalin, of course, is aware of this history and consciously secures its reinscription in every new present. He knows what traces have been left by the glorious Russian past, and he confidently retraces them," unquote. In restaging Repin's composition in the Vow, is yet another way to show Stalin retracing an episode from the past. What was it exactly that Chiaureli was trying to allude to in the scene? Is it in fact a historical illusion in a strict sense? Noteworthy is the dialogue that takes place in front of Repin's canvas. Surprisingly, the characters seem more interested in the author and his skillful representation of the people than in the actual subject matter of the painting. The dialogue goes, "Such wonderful portraits, aren't they? Who painted this? Repin. Who is it? Repin, I told you." Emphasizing the question of authorship and formal qualities of the painting, the dialogue functions as a meta-episode in the film, activating the viewer's awareness of the film's visual conventions. In fact, the director has already turned this meta-mode in the previous frame, in which Repin's painting almost equals the screen space, and the black silhouettes of the people look more like the spectators sitting in front of us in a theater hall than the actual characters of the Vow. The scene culminates then with the staging of the painting in St. George Hall, while we as spectators in the theater feel engaged, if not dragged, into the frame, and hence the circle of the admiring beholders of Stalin's speech. I argue that the reception of the village elders by Alexander III played the same role in the Vow that it had been playing since the installation in the antechamber of the Grand Kremlin Palace, that of a harbinger of the real encounter with the ruler. Chiaureli adopted the performative potential of the painting to stage his own version of the leader's ceremonial meeting with the people, in which Stalin replaces or retraces a ruler in the old imperial setting. In his speech, Stalin refutes the international bourgeoisie's assertions that, quote, "Having destroyed the old bourgeois system, the working class is incapable of building anything new to replace the old. The working class of our country has proved in practice that it is quite capable not only of destroying the old system, but of building a new system, the socialist system," unquote. While the replacement reference in Stalin's speech seems to allude to the substitution that has just taken place, its polemic tone echoes Alexander III's words inscribed on the gilded plaque of the picture frame, in which the Tsar warns the village elders to dispel the rumors circulating in the villages that the nobles' land was soon to be divided among the peasants. This parallel suggests another verbal or narrative aspect of the painting's influence on the resolution of the scene. It was not Alexander III as a historical character that Chiaureli was trying to emulate in his portrayal of Stalin, but a very concrete work of art, specific and inalienable from the ceremonial space of the palace, an archetypal image capable to engage the viewer, but also to transport them to another chronology and another reality. The Vow legitimized the reception of the village elders and its surroundings in the Grand Kremlin Palace as a new compositional center and a source of painterly myth-making in the post-war artistic production. In their large multi-figure canvases glorifying the Soviet leader, artists repeated the tropes of animated or staged painting. In Dmitry Nalbandyan's Reception in the Kremlin, May 24th, 1945, painted in 1947, The joyful procession led by Stalin seems to emanate right from Repin's canvas, clearly visible through the open doors of the antechamber. In the collective work, Glory to the Great Stalin, the composition repeats that of Repin's painting. One example of compositional borrowing is the cleared space in front of the leader, visually elevating his figure. Another example is the prevailing diagonal of perception from bottom left to top right, which in fact leads the viewer's gaze to a place behind Stalin towards the open doors in which a corner of Repin's painting can be discerned. Finally, Boris Yevganson's Our Wise Leader, Dear Teacher, Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin Among the People in the Kremlin from 1952, set in stone, is set in St. George Hall, reminds both Repin's composition and the scene in the vow. Leader's death, however, put an abrupt end to the elder's glorious afterlife in Stalin's Kremlin. In an internal memo submitted to Nikita Khrushchev 2 weeks after his secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, in which he denounced Stalin's cult of personality, Governor of the Kremlin reported on the changes in the antechamber following Stalin's death. In 1943, according to this memo, Georgy Malenkov, the premier of the Soviet Union after Stalin, ordered Repin's Reception of the Village Elders by Alexander III to be taken off and replaced by an existent or newly commissioned painting featuring Vladimir Lenin. A close association of Repin's canvas with Stalin's imagery conditioned its immediate oblivion as soon as its substituted prototype ceased to exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikita. You have given us so much to think about with this fascinating paper. I appreciate it. I'm going to hand the microphone then to our sobеседник for today, Anne Lounsbury from New York University.
Great, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. I'm really thrilled to have the chance to talk about this fantastic paper, really, really interesting paper, although with the caveat that that I just got it and not that many hours ago. And so my remarks are a little bit sketchy, maybe like the Łódź version of Repin's painting, the sketch. But there are so many things about it that speak to me. And I'm gonna give three short things that I thought we might approach in the discussion. The first is just the problem of representing imperial diversity in texts and on canvas. What does it mean to represent, quote, diversity? The second is the formal question of central versus peripheral figures, which is also a big question in narratological studies. And the third is this fascinating and bizarre kind of practice of restaging paintings in film, the sort of tableau vivant phenomenon and the ideological resonances of this practice. So first, to speak for a minute about this problem of representing, quote, diversity in the empire, what this painting and Balagurov's analysis of it immediately called to my mind is Leskov's 1873 повесть «Очарованный странник», which is almost like a companion piece to this painting. It's 10 years earlier than the painting. It's 1873, so previous decade. But what we get in Leskov's story is a sort of meditation on imperial diversity and how might it be represented. It's narrated by a peasant who's named Golovan, and it's the story of his sort of decades-long stranствование around the empire. And he covers pretty much the same ethnic groups that are covered in the painting. And he ranges from the Caspian Sea to Ukraine. So again, more or less we don't get Buryats, but more or less in the same geographic space that Repin's painting imagines through these ethnic types. And he encounters representatives of these various ethnic groups: Ukrainians, Jews, Cossacks, Germans, and especially people he calls Tatars. Sometimes they're what we would call Chechen, sometimes they're Kazakh, right? And he himself, this Golovan, who's narrating Leskov's weird story, he's an Orthodox Russian, he's born a serf, and we are told that he is a настоящий русский богатырь, typichny and dobry. So basically, the рассказчик in Leskov's story is the guy standing closest to Alexander III in the painting, right? So that's basically who gets to narrate the story. So he's supposed to be, we're introduced to him as русский богатырь, typichny, dobry. It turns out, as he's revealed in his own words, he's a beast, right? He's brutal, he's violent. He has no capacity for reflecting on his violence. So we're sort of left with this contradiction. Is he like добрый русский богатырь, or is he a monster, right? And the story has been read both ways. So I'm sorry for that long detour, but I just kept thinking about it when I was reading your analysis, because Leskov's text leaves us quite destabilized, I would say, as to, who this Golovan is. And I'm wondering, as you trace the evolution of Repin's painting and the decisions that he made, from the sketch through these other iterations, like, what kind of doubt is there about what he's representing as far as these imperial types? Or maybe this is not an appropriate question for a visual text. I'm not sure, but I kept thinking about it, like how visual images and also how art historians tease out ambivalences, contradictions, ironies. So one of my favorite moments in your analysis was when you focus on the, I think it's the Tatar in red, and you describe him as, quote, vividly marginalized. And that's really fascinating. Like, how can a character be both marginalized and vivid? Which maybe is a kind of semiotic layering, that a version of what we get in Leskov. Again, I'm sorry if it's not an appropriate kind of question. And I was wondering also if you could say a little bit more about, you talk about how in the sketch, there's more of, quote, the picturesque, right? And then if I'm remembering correctly, kind of a movement away from, quote, the picturesque in the final canvas. And if you could say a little bit more about what the picturesque means right there and what its ideological function is. Okay, so that's my first set of questions. My second and third are briefer. The second is on this really fascinating relationship between central and peripheral figures. So in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of literary criticism devoted to secondary characters and their role in narrative. So probably the pioneering text was someone named Alex Woloch wrote a book called The One versus the Many, Minor Characters and the Space of the Protagonist in the Novel. It's about 20 years old. And I'm wondering, is there a parallel line of analysis in visual culture? Like, is there a special way of looking or thinking about the edges of the painting? Because I really loved your attention to how the figures are arranged in sort of like layers of importance, right? And is there kind of an analogous way of thinking about center periphery as we've seen develop in literary studies? Okay, second, now my last question, and this is really just coming out of my astonishment, really, at the staging of the painting that you find in Klyatva, in Chiuli's film, which I find utterly convincing. And so my question is this common to restage paintings in films? The reason I ask, is it common, is because I teach a terrible 2008 film of Taras Bulba by Bortko. And I don't recommend it at all, but one thing it does that's very interesting that I noticed just kind of for no reason is that it absolutely restages Repin's Zaporozhye pишут письмо турецкому султану. Like it's a freeze frame, and you can freeze the frame and stop, and you can look at the Cossacks writing their letter, It's a copy of the painting. And I'm very intrigued by the sort of ideological and theoretical implications of this kind of reproduction. It seems very conservative to me. It seems like a way of saying, oh, look what we all already know, right? We know this image, we know this, and I'm going to show it to you again, but you already know it. And we're sort of here knowing it together, right? And I just wonder if this, happens regularly, or is this just a strange thing? And I was also wondering if it's, and I was talking about this a little bit with Margaret before, she was kind of helping me think through some of these remarks. And is this a sign of sort of self-conscious awareness of your national artistic tradition? Look, we all know this painting, and here I'm going to give it to you again. You could not do this, an American film could not restage a Winslow Homer painting and get everybody on board, saying, oh, wow, look, here we are together knowing the same thing. Okay, so that's it. Please respond or don't respond, as you see fit. And thank you for this absolutely wonderful paper.
Thank you so much, Anne. This was very rich, and it's just, I like those coincidences, but just to clear my brain, I just started to listen to Очарований странник, an audiobook, and I just finished it two days ago. So I feel that I'm on the same page, and I was also struck by these similarities, which with his descriptions of those travels around these borderlands of empire, and Tatars were particularly portrayed as nasty peoples in this description. So yeah, I think it's fascinating. It's actually literature is one of the medias that I didn't incorporate into my analysis, but I really interested in going deeper, thinking more about it, because primarily my sources that I tried to reconstruct were Repin's sources for these kinds of imperial gaze and imperial visions. So these were just some popular atlases which were published around that time, like late 1870s, the Peoples of Russian Empire, something like this, and but also the tradition of visual tradition as well. And so this goes to your question about the picturesque, and I wouldn't argue that in the final version he zooms off this picturesque quality. So it's still there, obviously, and scholars are right to argue that, for instance, the group with Alexander III's wife, Maria Feodorovna, is rendered in this impressionistic style, and there are lots of picturesque qualities to this painting as well. But what is more important for me is that it also introduces, maybe not that in the face, this hierarchical composition to the final painting. And this picturesque empire was a kind of trope, I would say, which partly described by Richard Wortman in his article about this exotic peoples as signs of empire, because so this picturesque image of different people gathering for the coronation for another czar is yet a kind of manifestation of the diversity and the richness of the empire. And he uses this word empire as painting. So but what Repin is coming up with, and the context which I tried to provide, suggesting a more kind of curated image of this picturesque, with a very like hierarchical take on this image. And yeah, so this center and periphery issue was also very important for me. And I think that the main difference between literary versus visual is that visual is two-dimensional, and it's easy to play with this in the two-dimensional space, providing like a position, a person in the periphery of the composition, but through other painterly means, as in the case with Tatar figure, to emphasize and to convey some other images. But I would be very much interested to look at the book which you mentioned. Thank you so much. As for the restaging the Repin's painting, I had to omit this, but in 1939, I guess, there was published an edited volume of articles. It's about the Soviet historical film, and there was published an article by Gutman, I think, who writes about the historical painting and its use in the Soviet films. And so he's suggesting a kind of recipes, what are the best ways to use historical paintings. And he mostly criticizes Eisenstein and some other directors for a kind of very technical again reproduction of the paintings, which oftentimes, according to Gutman, do not give anything unless this kind of acknowledgement that, okay, we can see, we can acknowledge this painting. But oftentimes he suggests that it kind of puzzles us because the directors use these images but the characters on the paintings, they are different from those which are replicating those images in the film, and this is for him is a bad example. So I was to me my first reaction was that Chiureli's film is he's very diligent in following the advice of Gutman in reproducing this scene, because it makes all the sense in this setting, but at the same time it's still different because it still refers it's more about the agency of the painting itself that makes it the work in this film than just this work of associations, probably. Yeah, I think I must have missed something, but thank you so much for the wonderful questions.
Thank you both. I didn't get a
Yeah.
chance to thank Anne for your discussion, and I wanted to say to everyone, please, this is your time for comments, questions. Nikita приветствует вопросы и на русском языке, если вам удобно. So please ask your question, make your comment, but as I put in the chat, you'll have to raise your hand in order to, and we'll invite you to unmute yourself. I think Hillary is going to do that. So we have a question from Yevgeny and then from Elizabeth Valkanier.
Thanks, Nikita. That was fun. I was thinking about the final sort of thoughts in your presentation about whether this painting, has this internal nature that it sort of wants to do certain things on its own, as in to stage something, stage an event and then involve us into an event. And now, as far as I remember, now at the Tretyakov Gallery, it is in a room with several other paintings, and so the ceiling is not that tall in that room, and it actually loses that quality, in my opinion, because the height is wrong and the size is wrong, and there are other paintings which sort of argue with it. It fails to deliver on what you what you do sort of convincingly argue that it wants to do that. But the setting really changes that. I don't know if you remember its current setting. At the same time, when they did an exhibition and put it in a separate room, you know, I think it was the only one or something like that, it came back again. So I was just thinking, it's not a question that perhaps what the sociologists of architecture call affordance, I don't know what the English version is of that. That is that like the door handle has affords us to grasp it, you know, because it's designed with that grasping motion in mind. So that is perhaps a less I don't know. It's art history is difficult for me. So that sort of concept, I think, fits the painting well and describes sort of the potential for it to stage an audience, you know, to arrange us around it, rather than this sort of actual, you know, quality inherent to it.
Yeah, thank you. This is yeah, I had, I think, 3 or 4 different versions for the conclusions for this talk, but in the end I decided to stop where I stopped and hear what would be the audience's takeaways from this, and I'm glad that I did so. Yeah, thank you. I will think about it, because, well, I point to this kind of site specificity of this painting in the Grand Kremlin Palace, and I agree that it loses its oomph effect in Tretyakov Gallery or elsewhere in the exhibitions, although in Helsinki I saw how it was hanged, and it was very good. It was positioned next to the Крестный ход в Kurской губернии, which was a very interesting context for this question, and I discussed this context in my chapter, but I had to omit it. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a question from Elizabeth Valkenier, who, can you unmute yourself, Elizabeth? And then we have a question that's in the chat from John Vanderveert that came to me, and then Elise Wirtschafter in turn. Elizabeth.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much. Listen, I would like to add another aspect, a political one, to your discussion. Very interesting, a very fruitful discussion. Namely, that Repin had liberal intentions in placing the Tsar the way he did, that close to the people. And actually the Imperial Commission, which okayed his original sketch, insisted on increasing the distance between the Tsar and the people, so which of course he had to obey and so on. But anyway, the original intention of Repin, as seen from some of the sketches I had seen, I forget where, but anyway, was to have the Tsar really closer to the people, and then the Imperial Commission that had to okay the final version insisted on this political separation and elevating the Tsar a little more by creating a sense of distance between him and the people. So that's all I wanted to add. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and you write it in your book on Repin and in the Передвижники, and yes, and it's and what Professor Wortman also argues, that this is about this new image of monarchy which was introduced by Alexander III, and this closeness to the people. But what I was trying to add, that it was a particular people which he wanted to be particularly close, and whereas others were a bit further detached or away from this central Orthodox imperial core. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Great. So great. Next question came to me as a direct message from John Vandervert saying, I'm fascinated by the connection between the Stalinist trope of father of peoples and Alexander III's abolishment of serfdom, which was then attached onto the painting's interpretation. After Stalin's death, you mentioned the painting became a Stalinist semiotic and had to be replaced. Do you know how the painting was received following Stalin's death? Did it return to imperial symbolism or retain a Stalinist veil?
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful question. I was citing Ribbentrop, who made this mistake about this. This is the depiction of Alexander II after the abolition of serfdom. As for the Stalinist, after the death of Stalin, so the painting was taken away, and so it never saw the light of the day before. Well, it was shortly transferred to the State Tretyakov Gallery, I think, in 1953, but before 1960s, when there was this exhibition of the new acquisitions of the Tretyakov Gallery, it didn't see the audience, and it was presented for this exhibition. And a very famous art historian, Sarabyanov, wrote, I think, in Soviet Culture, an article about this exhibition, and he wrote that, well, this painting won't make a case for the great history of Russian art. So he was very skeptical about this painting. But then I think in 90s, it already was also exhibited by the current curators, Tatiana Yudenkova, and I think, and then it was introduced to the permanent collection, and since then it's there. As for the current imperial implications, I would say that, well, not about particularly this painting, but Putin is very much fond of Alexander III as the figure, and probably we should take a closer look at the cultural production. Recently, for instance, in the Crimea several years ago, there was an opening of the monument to Alexander III, which features the Alexander III sitting in the center, and the sculptor, or probably he was advised to choose this particular citation from the Tsar, that Russia has only two allies, the Russian fleet and the army. And there was a big opening of this exhibition with president attending and given his speech in front of Alexander III, surrounded with now journalists, not the peoples of the Russian Federation. But still, it is obviously an interesting topic to explore. Thank you.
That is fascinating. All right, so we have questions from Elise, Elena, who have their hands up. And then I have a question, I think this is in sequence, from Catherine Young, and then we'll return to the hands up, Joan Norberger. So Elise, can you unmute yourself? Hillary, you've invited, yes.
So my question, I'm curious about your use of the term tribe. I'm not sure, I think it was your use, but also from your sources, rather than people or nation. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that. And then there are a couple of historiographical themes that I think your presentation, really interesting presentation, relates to. And one is the question of who speaks for the people, the conflict between the monarchy and the intelligentsia over this question of who speaks for the people or peoples of the empire. And then also the question of bringing the people or the nation into the political arena. So, and I also like all this connecting with Alexander III and Stalin and Putin. So I don't need to comment on that. You've already done that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was to the first question about tribe. I was quite surprised when I saw this term pleme used very often in the sources, and the sources are this. I think it's also in Coronation album. But also in these popular atlas, which I also cited about the peoples, of the Russian Empire. Pleme, yes, was the word used. So I don't think I can go deep into this. It's probably a question for more historians of nationalism and ethnicity of that period, which I'm not, but I was also curious about that. And yeah, monarchy and intelligentsia. So I had to meet a lot of arguments from my book chapter, unfortunately, but it's very important. And this goes back to Anne's question about these the kind of Repin's positionality in this story, right? Like how he himself, what is his relation to what he's depicting himself, and it's important to look at these commission within the context of the other works he has been working on, especially these again the procession of the cross in the Kursk governorate, where he actually employs a kind of this alienating also in a way, in the sense of kind of internal colonization gaze towards the Russian people of the Kursk province, portraying them quite exotic to the intelligentsia, so to speak, right? And there's literature about how well these narodniki would employ this kind of colonial gaze towards their own people. But then he receives these commissions, this commission, and we see that he can't, of course, represent the people the way he represented them in his procession of the cross. It's a completely different gaze that he is commissioned to adopt as well for performing this painting. Yeah, so yeah, thank you. I think I covered those.
Great, thank you. Yelena Lyubimova, would you please unmute yourself?
Yes, I did. This is just a small note to add to the question that was discussed earlier on the relations between the paintings and cinematographs, Soviet cinematograph. It's not only historical painting, that also the landscape painting, particularly Levitan, was very influential. And I just wanted to show you the catalog of the exhibition. It's called
«Сними мне Левитана».
«Сними мне Левитана».
Yes. Спасибо большое. Да, я знаю этот каталог, его редактировала Кира Долинина.
Кира Долинина, да. И у нас были параллели, я тогда работала в еврейском музее, и у нас были параллели живопись и фрагменты из фильмов авторского кинематографа. Это было очень интересно.
Да, это совершенно замечательный текст и подборка этих, да, но это уже более позднее время, 70-е, как раз эпоха застоя, когда Левитан как раз таки стал актуален, да, то есть это тоже история про то, как какой-то художник в какой-то конкретный момент становится, да, актуальным в кинематографе.
Да, и это тоже, да. That's it.
Спасибо.
Wonderful. Thank you for bringing that up. So we have a question in the chat, and then we'll go to Joan. The question that came to me in the chat from Catherine Young is something that's been under quite a bit of discussion lately. Svetlana Shields has argued that Repin identified as Ukrainian within the Russian imperial context, of course. She asks, do you see aspects of that self-identification as Ukrainian in your analysis of this painting?
Yes, thank you so much. There's also a wonderful, very detailed article by, this just slipped from my mind, a very famous historian of Ukrainian history, and he just published a book, I think this year, about this Ukrainian history, where there is this article about Repin's Zaporozhce, and he also published an article about Repin, a painter from Ukraine, where he discusses this very delicate question of Repin's self-identification, and in different times of his career and life, Repin would identify himself, well, sometimes as Russian, sometimes as Ukrainian, and it's really, we should take a look at the context when and what he's doing. But for my painting that I'm analyzing, there is the signature where he puts his signature on a person in a white coat who is most likely the Slavic, or it's difficult to say, but most probably like the Russian peasant, whilst the one standing right next to him, you can see later in the brown coat, is identified by some of the critics as the Ukrainian one. So they're both standing each shoulder to shoulder with each other. And but what I was trying to claim is that his kind of artistic persona was identified with this man in the purple coat, the man who is by his painterly by its peculiar color contradicts the main narrative of the painting, whereas Repin as a kind of visitor and the witness of the event from the subject meta point of view, he aligns himself with this kind of Russian-Ukrainian perspective. And I don't think that he, from what I can say, he doesn't make this also distinction, a very vivid distinction between the Russian and Ukrainian. And that was something that was, again, in the sources that he was using, that it was the whole kind of tribe. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we've had 3 new hands go up. I'm not going to call on the old hands. I'm just going to call on first Joan.
Okay, great. Hi, Nikita. Thank you so much for this really fascinating paper. And I'm so glad to see both the ways that you've developed it since we first talked about it, and I read the early version, and also that it's being published. I'm delighted to hear that. So that's great. I have 2 comments or questions, and I'll be really brief about them. The first one is picks up on the last question, actually, which is I'm curious about where this painting and your discussion of it fits into Repin's career more generally, or, you know, as a whole. Specifically, not so much in terms of as a painter, but specifically in terms of the ways he represented the balance, if you will, between Russian power and imperial power, like Russian state power, which he was fascinated by and painted a lot of, and imperial power. And also, I mean, and if you can talk about where, I don't know if you can talk about where that fits in to the vow, which is really fascinating use of it. I'm so glad I didn't know this, so I'm so glad to have you talk about that. And then the other question picks up on Anne's question about cinema. And I'm just going to say, oh my God, yes, of course, filmmakers quote earlier films, paintings, not just landscape and historical paintings, but all paintings, not just Eisenstein, but all filmmakers. Homage in cinema is as important as it is in every single art, right? I mean, it's a huge piece of what artists do, which is respond to people in their own disciplines, but also in others. And I would say, really remake them, right? I mean, that's the whole point. It's not just a point And maybe in some cases, it's a point of just saying, look, we're all of, a certain class or taste or something. And so we share this reference to something. But I think in most cases, at least the filmmakers, not just Eisenstein, obviously, but most filmmakers want to do something new with what they are citing. So that comes back to that brings me back to the Stalin question, which is related to the earlier Repin question, which is, to what extent do you think that Kleatva is restating or reshaping the sort of imperial valence, well, both the imperial valence and also Stalin as a leader, right, in the cult of personality, as opposed to Stalin as an imperial leader? I don't know if that makes sense, but I see those as two very different things, represented very differently in all, different works of art and history and so. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts on those subjects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. Yeah, this is a interesting question, and I was thinking about this imperial dimension in Kleatva because it's not usually discussed in these terms. It's more about other things, but you still have those different representatives of different republic and this idiom of these Дружба народов, and but there's also this subtle idea that the Russian people, they are kind of the elder brother for all other peoples, and this is something subtle, and also it is a bit subtle in Repin's painting as well. But I found it's also interesting that these in the paintings which I showed in the end of the late 40s, early 50s, this idiom of Stalin as the father of the people is coined and represented against Repin's painting as well. So yeah, I don't know if it answers your question, but speaking about the position of the painting in Repin's career, it's also a big discussion. And of course, it was a very unusual commission for him and a very unusual commission for the Minister of Imperial Court, because it was mostly for the first time that they commissioned like a huge realist painting about a very contemporary event. So, and what I was particularly interested is that how this imperial idea would be translated with the means of realism rather than a more common tropes of Baroque art and things like that, something that we know how Baroque aesthetics works with the ideas of empire and things like that. But with realist mode, it is something that I was particularly interested in this painting. Yeah, but I will keep thinking about this and also looking forward to your volumes to come up and to learn more about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yana, and then Maria Chupcheva. Yana, okay, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was super interesting. And I have a very short question. I'm interested in this Kremlin Palace and this place where the painting was exhibited. It seems that it is a very particular place for an ideological and political message. And now the painting is not there anymore. Do you know anything about what is exhibited at this particular place now, or it is empty, or do we know something about that?
Yes, thank you so much, Yana. That was one of the versions for me to conclude my presentation. So, yeah, so according to these well, the Malenkov commission that the painting should be taken off and then a new painting should be put up there. And so that happened. And so there were two paintings depicting Lenin in different occasions there. But then in early 90s, I think, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course. So a new painting should be put there, and they put the painting under Yeltsin by I don't remember the name of the artist, but it's a historical composition with a huge battle happening there, featuring Alexander Nevsky, and with also the words, a citation, "Кто с мечом к нам придет, от меча и погибнет." So, and that painting is still there. And when you, I just watched several weeks ago an inauguration of Putin from, I don't remember when, but it was featured there, and he was entering also the antechamber, and the person who was commenting the event, he mentioned that, and that's this painting is there. So this is a very interesting and important to take a look at what is surrounding the rulers, and because it sends certain messages, and also in context of agency of the paintings, and what do they want and what do they call for.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much. Okay, Maria, please unmute yourself.
Nikita, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I have little comments for your talk in the context of ideological implications. Maybe it is possible to useful for you the article by Goldstein about the generational conflict, because it's I don't know about the critical response to the to this Repin's painting, but in this time in Russian ideological discourse, the imperial the empire was and people was considered as family and as unity, and maybe it, in the context of family, it's really important in this case. And several months ago, I found in Moskovsky Ведомости the response to Makovsky's painting in this that was content with discourse and the idea of unity around the Moscow, and maybe with direction it's really interesting to you. I can send to you this quote.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. That would be very interesting. Yeah, and this idea of family and unity is in the painting, and also Stalinist.
I think it is really in the political thought is commonplace at this time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Masha.
Wonderful. Well, I see we don't have any more comments in the chat. So if anyone else wants to raise your hand, now is the moment, but we're already risking going over time. I want to thank everyone for their participation. Thank you for your generous comments. We have okay, one more thing. I have put in the chat information about our 19V art history seminar, which helped, not to brag, but helped Nikita workshop his paper, but it's helped a lot of us. So we'll have a question from Anastasia. Please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Никита, у меня такой вопрос с точки зрения каких-то сакральных образцов для подобного построения пространства, потому что она довольно специфична. С одной стороны, у нас изображена толпа, что для этих лет это такое, как бы, в общем, общее место, и у нас очень много прецедентов. но у нее не два центра и вообще нет никакой агрессивной части. И вот это строение по кругу, какие есть вот здесь какие-то, может быть, подспудно совершенно употребляемые иконографические сакральные образцы? Спасибо огромное.
Спасибо большое, Анастасия. Да, как раз на первом семинаре, когда на 19V, когда я представлял этот материал, я буквально спрашивал коллег какие-то действительно иконографические образцы в связи с тем, что и Элизабет Валкенер в своей книге упоминает это, ссылаясь на Грабаря, о том, что Репина Министерство двора пыталось уговорить, чтобы он написал царя как Христа, проповедующего народу. А потом, если посмотреть внимательно на ссылки, то Грабарь немножко искажает свой пересказ письма Стасова к Репину или наоборот, сейчас точно не помню, и по всей видимости, это не совсем так, но так или иначе, вот эта христологическая тема здесь меня тоже интересовала, и в частности, Галина Мардилович, которая была на этой презентации, предложила параллель с птитом, с рембрандтовской гравюрой «Проповедь Христа». И действительно, она показывает и объясняет вот это пространство перед ним, которое как бы возвышает фигуру, стоящую в центре. И мы действительно видим, ряд исследователей показывает, что в этот период Репин в целом увлекался Рембрандтом и копировал другие фигуры в своих картинах или набросках, по крайней мере, из рембрандтовских, тоже христологических гравюр. То есть это один из возможных источников. Ну и вот это вот действительно такая религиозная, сакральная составляющая здесь присутствует, но я решил ее опустить для настоящего доклада, но я все еще думаю о ней, особенно в связи тоже со сталинским нарративом, где это тоже присутствует, поскольку по апокрифическому замечанию Эдварда Родзинского, историка, Чаурелли, Берия, по-моему, вручил сценарий Чаурелли, исправленный Сталиным, со словами о том, что Иосиф Виссарионович хочет, чтобы вы изобразили в этом фильме Сталина как мессию, а, значит, Ленина как пророка его. Да, то есть здесь, очевидно, эта идея тоже затрагивалась. Спасибо большое за вопрос.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you, Nikita. Thank you, everyone, for coming to today's seminar. And thank you for this just fascinating paper, Nikita. Amazing work, fabulous primary source research, discoveries, interpretation, just everything was just fascinating. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for coming and for your comments and for listening. So we hope to see you next week, right? We have a seminar next week from Elise Wirtschafter presenting on a very different subject, on diplomacy in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, and with a discussant, with a собеседник, Catherine Phillips. So thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Nikita.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was great.
Thank you.